All right, so we've got a super incredible privilege today. I'm sitting down with Martin Black, who is someone I've known for how many years? It's been, I think, 9 or 10 years since I first rode in this class.
I would think all of 10, but
Yeah,
who's count?
that's right. Yeah, too long. Let's be honest.
In high school, wasn't you?
I was barely into high school, I think, when I first met you, and I was a working student for Donette Hicks, and it's through Jim and Donette that we kind of first got going. So it's super cool here. All these years later, we get to do this and kind of get your insights, your perspective, some of the history, both of your life, of your family's history out in the Great Basin, and whatever else comes up. But yeah, I'm super excited to do this today. So the world knows you as a horseman, clinician, as an author. You've created many videos. You're also a craftsman. But when I asked you how you describe what you do to someone who's got no concept of your background, you said something interesting. You said real estate developer and investor. I want you to maybe elaborate on that, what you meant by that for a second.
Well, you do what you got to do to survive and pay bills. And I don't hate my job. It's the best job I've ever had. That's what I really enjoy, is spending time with the family. I got grandkids, and especially I just got a smaller operation. But that's what I really enjoy. I mean, if I could get up every morning and just say, what are you going to do? I mean, there's a time, it's a good example, that everybody was leaving, everybody around the ranch was going for whatever, this or that, I can't remember, and I'm home alone. It's like, you know what, I've just got to take a day off and just do what I want to do. I don't want to go visit these people or go do this, go do that. I never have been a good tourist. Europe and Australia and South America and Africa and blah, blah, blah. I can't wait to get home. It's interesting, you see all these churches and castles, but after a while, there's just another pile of rocks. They just arrange them different. And it's neat to see once a lot of times, but after a while, it's like, I've seen all them rocks I want, but I'm ready to go home. Yeah. But I'd take very little extra time playing tourist. It's interesting to see the Alps once. I've seen mountains. I grew up in the mountains. The Alps are more mountains. They're different than what these big mountain ranges that we have here, but it's not that much different, from my perspective. Now, if you live in the city, that's altogether different. I walk around the city looking up the skyscrapers. That's different. Not that I like it, but it's different.
Yeah, that's true. I think as a person, I'm slightly different. I love to see what's over the next ridge, over, in the next place. It's totally just a difference of who you are, I guess, Yep. What you were saying about, if you could, you'd play on the ranch and you'd spend time with family all you could. And I think, in the world today, they tell you so much the reverse, right? That you need to go to work.
Well, we got to pay bills.
Sure.
And, I kind of grew up with the understanding, I'm fifth generation on both sides of my maternal and paternal. And, they came out here in covered wagons, and, their house burned down, a flood took it away. They lost everything multiple times. Even in my granddad's time, no government assistance. You lost your house, you build another one. Neighbors might help you, or maybe not. If you live too remote, you don't get much help from your neighbors because they're busy surviving on their own,
So where did they settle?
What's that?
Where did they settle?
Southwest Idaho, Bruno area. I never got too far from there. My maternal side was just a little ways away, 50 miles away. But they both come out here before the livestock came, and they weren't miners, but they provided goods for the miners. Processed charcoal, obviously cheese and butter was a big thing that they sold miners. So they had lots of milk cows. There's 260 or 70 milk cows, and the girls done that. And, the guys cut wood, hauled it in there, pretty quick there. They got all the wood close to the mining towns cut down, and for firewood, for building whatever they're building, tunnels and houses and whatnot. So they're going 20 miles away to find a tree to cut down. So that's where they got into the charcoal, is they could condense, from my understanding of charcoal. Basically, you burn the wood to a certain point and then smother it, and it's like ashes left in a fire pit. But it's a lot lighter to haul because it doesn't have the moisture in it, and they can haul a lot more of it. So when they get about so far out there, they're cutting wood and making charcoal out of it and then hauling it in instead of just getting a wagon load of post-type material. They done all kinds of stuff like that to supply for the miners. I don't know the statistics, but I'm going to say for every miner that actually goes in the tunnel or runs the mill or does something directly for the mine, there was probably 10 people that was hauling groceries and supplies to them, you know. So that the bigger part of the population, like my family's, was providing for the miners. And then in the 70s, California passed a law that closed the open range, basically. So, and we're still in open range states, Oregon and Nevada. And so the ranchers in California said, stuff that. We can't go fence all these farmers' fields and keep our cows out. We'll go to Nevada and Idaho and Oregon where, you know, they got to fence our cows off their property. That's the difference between open range. And so that would be the generation of my great-grandparents. They grew up, my great-granddad, they would migrate with the stock to the mountains in the summer and to the valley, Bruno Valley in the winter. So they were somewhat nomads. They just followed their stock. So when they was in the summer, that's when the different ranches would come around and brand their cows and gather their beef for the year and whatnot. But my uncle told me there was 6 vaquero wagons that would camp on the same creek as these kids when they was growing up. And I think, how awesome would that be to be a little kid? I mean, everybody wants to be a fireman or a policeman or when you're a little kid. And here are these guys with their fancy silver bits and their fancy broke horses and the Piatas and their roping skills and everything. That's what them kids grew up seeing.
Yeah.
And you can look at pictures. I got pictures of them. And of course, you know, their dads, my granddad's granddad, and he come from the Midwest. One of them, the other one on my maternal side, come straight from Ireland. But anyway, they wouldn't have had that heritage. It come to be in the second generation that was out there. And so, I mean, you look at pictures of them and they got the look. I mean, they got the silver bits and the riatas all nice and neat on their saddles, and their horses are all groomed, you know.
Got braided ropes.
Right, nice looking outfits, nice looking horses, and they just look, you know, and I mean, that's kind of the vaquero thing, you know, if you, not saying just because you look handy, you are handy, but typically, especially more in the old days, if you worked that hard, you probably was that interested and worked hard to be a good hand too. Now we're getting further away from that now. There's a lot of recreation riders that look good, but they can't even find their way home, let alone bring any cows with them. You know, so
there you go. So the utility is lost, necessity. But so for you growing up, that's kind of the culture you saw, right? That was majority of your exposure.
You know, every generation says it's not like it used to be, you know, because it changes, you know, in a 20, 30 year period, whatever you count as a generation. But what I seen in my generation was the range got fenced up big time. The only fences when I was a young, the forest built a fence on the state line. The Nevada forest built a fence on the Idaho-Nevada state line. But other than that fence, I don't know of any fence in the area that didn't fence private ground, like a homestead or whatever. That's the only other fences. You could go hundreds of miles any direction and not have to open a gate unless you enter somebody's private ground or that forest fence.
Yeah. I've talked about this in my other videos, and it was really demonstrated, though, on the Year of the Mustang journey, because as soon as I, get out of where there's so much public land, it's fences for days, right? Another drop gate and another cattle guard.
Well, the federal ground, BLM enforced, in the 70s and 80s, they do their lab tests, and they come up with these university studies and blah, blah, blah. Well, all right, that might work in Kentucky, but we're not in Kentucky. I don't see that much improvement. They did improve water sources. They put some pipelines in and whatnot, but their grazing management, and again, there was room for improvement on the overall grazing, but a lot of the stuff that they done was ridiculous. I mean, they had your livestock grazing, I'll exaggerate a little bit, but they wanted you to graze your livestock on the mountain peaks in the winter, and down in the valleys in the summer. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but to make a point, it was ridiculous, some of the stuff that they wasn't good for the livestock. But some scientists and wherever come up with the idea, and the government would shove it down your throat.
Gotcha. So it's been a bit of a hindrance as far as public land leases goes for
a lot of
livestock owners.
The other thing, for example, the range cons, the peons that are out there actually doing the stuff for the BLM on your cows and measuring grass and, seeing if it's all in the right proportion. When I was young, they was all pretty much local ranch kids. Yeah, they might be from 100 miles away or 200 miles away, but they were guys that would go out there and not get lost. They didn't need a GPS to find, where Camas Creek is or find their way home from Camas Creek. They knew how to get around. They knew which way north was without looking at their compass. Things like that you learn on living on the land like that.
Yeah.
And you learn this stuff generationally. You don't necessarily learn it in a book. But then they got away from that and they started hiring a lot of people educated on the East Coast. Educated, and they're talk to people out there that you can tell by the way they talk. They're not very, it's not proper English. They're not that educated. So it's just it was a bad mix.
So I asked you, what's an experience from your growing up that still influences today, your life today? And you said being cold and hungry and never wanting to go back. So I want you to elaborate on that answer a little bit.
Well, that's what I appreciate my job right now. I rarely go hungry. I'm overfed, underworked, overpaid. I shouldn't say that too loud, but I mean, this is the best job I've ever had, working for the public, basically. Like I say, at these clinics, they feed me good. I get to bed early unless we get to partying. And, it's good. And growing up, we might eat today and we might not. My granddad, I don't know. A lot of Navy SEALs probably couldn't have kept up with him. He would eat and drink when we got home. He never packed a lunch. He never, we just lived like Indians. And when there's an opportunity to eat, we'd eat. If there wasn't an opportunity to eat, we kept riding and kept working and kept going. And, if it's too far to get home that night, let's just sleep in our blankets and we'll finish, this doing the work that we need to do in this area. We'll go home tomorrow. There's plenty of times we'd go out and go to work and wouldn't come home that night and just stay out on the range, basically, and that part of the country, and might even be over in the neighbor's country. And again, no fences. So it's not like, we're checking pastures. It was millions and millions of acres and no fences.
100%.
So your cattle would stray off 20 miles from home over in the neighbor's.
It'd take you a whole day to go get one cow, or almost.
Well, you just kind of rode around waters, you kind of patrolled, basically, if there's nothing else to do. You weren't branding calves, you weren't gathering, your steers to ship, or wasn't anything specific that needed done. You went out and just patrolled to see if these cattle were out of salt, if the spring's drying up over where these cattle are, if they're out of feed there. You got more bulls than what you need over here. You don't have enough bulls over there. A lot of our deal, especially early in the summer, we'd just bunch some cows up and take them over here, even though we might bunch them up and bring them back in 2 weeks, because every time you bunch your cows up, the bulls go to work. All your cows are concentrated there. So that's how we got our cows bred up better. We didn't have pastures to hold them in. And like I say, if the balance was off a little bit on the bull-cow ratio, put them together and go find better water for them or better feed for them. That's just what we'd done if there wasn't anything else to do. It was horseback, every day practically, 99% of the time at least. But every day we got up and just went to find how we could improve things for the cattle. Because the better you took care of your cattle, the bigger your paycheck was. I didn't get a paycheck because I was working for Dad. But that was more income. We didn't lock them in a field. And I see this all the time now. We got fences. It might be a 100,000 acre field. We lock them in the field. They think it's like putting beans in a jar and putting them on the shelf. We come back in a month or 6 months, and we should be able to take those beans, out of that jar, and they'll all still be there. It's not how it works. Somebody left a gate open over there. Now your cows went on to the neighbors, and your neighbors don't ride any more than you do, so they don't know what their cows are doing. They might drive around on the roads and make sure there's salt out, or, a little bit, but we wore out a lot of horseshoes and had a lot of horses broke, and it was just a different style of management.
Yeah, it's a completely different way of living on horses or having horses, and what that means as well. And that's hearing you tell those stories, I think, really gives people an insight to the nuances that are really so many people are not even aware of, right, who own horses today, and in modern America.
Well, it's kind of revolutionary in the sense that, my dad, I'd done pretty much what my dad done when he was younger, and his dad done what his dad done. We took care of the livestock on the range, and there wasn't that much change. The biggest change was my granddad's generation is where the transition from horses to cattle came in. The first 3 generations, they didn't have many cattle. They had some. But their primary livestock was horses. They obviously raised horses. They would, get them broke to ride. They sold a lot of them to the military. They had to pass a riding test before the Army would accept them. And some of them, they would get broke and trail them down through northern Nevada, where a lot of them big ranches, had big crews, 10, 15, maybe 20 buckaroos on the crew, head of horses or whatever they had broke. And they'd be green broke. They'd travel down through there. And it's 175 miles from Bruno to Elko. And what is it? About the same, maybe 150 or whatever. I can't remember, from Elko to Winnemucca. Basically, you're making a big circle around the Waihe Desert. And they would, a small crew would take those horses and pull into them ranches like traveling salesmen. And this ranch might take 10, this ranch might make 25 or whatever. And however long it took them they might just take a few. But when they ran out of horses, they'd turn around and come home. And that might be a 250 mile circle that they made. Week, 2 weeks, there's a little bit of socializing and salesmanship went along with it. That wasn't just on an endurance ride, see how fast they could do it. But that's the kind of stuff they'd done. Another thing they'd done was, because handling horses on the open range was their livelihood, they were better at handling horses than some of the people that just handled cattle. Some of the ranches that their primary livestock was cattle. And so they done basically contract horse gathering, to them as Mustangs. That's a Spanish term,
right? But
they just called them range horses. They weren't wild horses. Most of the horses, pretty much all of their horses, I think, I've got pictures of them, gathering horses on the open range, just like cattle, and holding an open and sorting horses out of the... Yeah. Now they go out there and they got somebody holding what we call the ones that the livestock that you cut out. Somebody's holding them out there and there might be however many different Prowdas that they have. This kid's holding that Prowda. It doesn't take, any high-skilled person to hold the Prowda, because they're broke. And, they didn't have corrals, especially to handle big numbers of livestock. So everything's worked outside. I mean, my son's in the cattle business. He doesn't bring the cattle to the corral. They use the open rodeer method that's been used for generations to sort his cattle. I mean, if your livestock is broke, and my point is, their horses were broke as good as a lot of people's cattle today. And you sort them outside. You don't have to take them to... And a lot of times out there, even today, I know they might have a little corral here, but usually at the ranch, a lot of them camps and stuff, all the corrals for is to put your horses in at night or something. They're not even capable of handling a big bunch of cattle. There's some horse corrals. And there again, the horses aren't kept up. They're out grazing, in a section or however big a field. And you wrangle them into the corral, and you might leave your horses in the corral overnight so you can leave before daylight. You don't have to go look for your horse out in the field. But the rest of the horses are out at night, typically. That's the way it was when I was growing up. But anyway, those horses were broke to handle, and they could handle them on the range, and they never had to bring them to the corral to sort them or brand them or whatever. Not saying they didn't sometimes. Most of them, my granddad showed me a picture, and it was taken from up on a hill. And there's a big blob of stock, you can tell. And all these cowboys around, bucker around, you can see them. They look like about that high, from that distance. And that was 1,000 head of horses that they trailed, I don't know where in the Midwest, but my family and the buckaroos from Bruno trailed them about 200 miles to American Falls. And some Wyoming cowboys met them. They got off the train and met them, and they trailed them horses on back to Missouri or wherever they was going. I never did hear. And the Bruno guys just threw their saddles on the train, and all the horses went back, with them. But that's how they sold the horses. They sold 1,000 head in that lot. And you do the math, there's only 35 horses, I think it was, fit in a carload. And those old steam engines, they only took like 4 or 5 carloads of horses per train, getting through these mountains and whatever, going back there. It's not the big engines you have today that's 300 cars on them.
So they were just going around and around.
Yeah.
Picking up more.
So do the math. If you had 5 carloads of horses at 35 a head, that's not that many horses. So if you got 1,000 head, do the math. That's however many carloads. That's a lot of horses.
Yeah.
So you got that 1,000 head. Think of the logistics of that. You take those 1,000 head to the stockyard, and you're how long holding those horses out here grazing them, waiting for the trains to keep cycling in, or you have to bring 200 head at a time in off the range, which is 30, 40 miles away. You'd be all summer doing it. So it makes sense to me. They said, stuff it. Let's just trail them back there. No. It'll be quicker and easier. Horse will they'll be better grazing them all the way back there than they will put them on a train. So, but it was a different mentality.
Yeah, it's super different.
Yeah.
I know everyone asks you about Tom and Ray, but as someone, who's so young to only have been able to read what they wrote, I'm going to ask you anyways, because I want to know kind of how you first met Ray. And I'll start you with that.
Well, Ray's oldest daughter married Bill Van Norman, and he was a rancher. Him and his dad, Charlie Van Norman, ranched north of Elko a little ways. So this was pretty much before Ray was on the road much giving clinics. He was very limited in the clinics that he'd done. So he still had ranch jobs from time to time, and he was starting horses for the public in California. That was his primary income, and the biggest amount of time that he was spending was basically riding horses for the public. And he managed a ranch over north of Reno, Gerlach, Nevada. And that's where he was when I first met him. And Ray showed a horse in the Elko Fair, which was, in that day, was, one of the biggest horse shows on an equal to a lot of the big shows in California. Not to get into that too much, but Elko was a big show, and Bill showed stuff at Elko, and Melvin Jones and a bunch of other people I know, and people from Bruno, kind of relatives of mine that went to work in Nevada and became good horsemen. And, some of those are my mentors too. Everybody knows Tom and Ray because of the clinics. Ray Hunt and Tom Dorrance's names are very familiar with a lot of people. I asked Ray's first wife, Millie. Ray was showing horses and winning, and, he had a lot of accomplishments before he hooked up with Tom Dorrance. So, and I know I've seen family pictures of Ray winning, this horse show and that horse show, and Salinas, for example, and Salinas was one of the big shows in California back in the day, and I think it's still a pretty big show. So, Ray didn't really start riding, being a cowboy at least, until he was 19, and he left home and went down to work in Nevada. So it wasn't like he grew up with it. He grew up around horses, but his dad had work teams. So he's familiar with horses, but he wasn't familiar with cowboy, buckaroo kind of stuff, making battle horses specifically. So from 19 to say 35 or whatever it was, he accomplished quite a bit. How did he do that? Who helped him? Well, there's, not to get on too far of a rabbit trail, but there was the TS Ranch my uncle managed for a guy in California. And a lot of Bruno kids, my uncle didn't want to hire just any cowboy that wanted a job. They'd probably have a drinking problem. He didn't want to deal with that. So he hired these young kids from Bruno. So the Jones boys went down there. Several other relatives went down there. His crew, the majority of them, came from Bruno because that's where Paul was from. Knew everybody. Paul Black, me and my uncle. Well, that's what got Ray Hunt down there.
Okay.
Even though my uncle had already left, Ray didn't actually work for my uncle, but he was right, I don't know, within 6 months or a year. That momentum was already created. And so it was actually my granddad's first cousin told Ray, he was working with Ray and a ranch in Bruno. He said, if you want to be a cowboy, go down there, because they're in the saddle every day, all day, full time. So that's what Ray done when he was 19. And so then, I think everybody's pretty familiar with the story of Hondu. And, Ray could be a little forceful. And
he was a very rough around the edges personality. Was it? Or a very old personality?
Like a lot of young guys, the temper would kind of get in the way sometimes. And, he's obviously doing some things right. He got on. I don't mean to sound like that. But like a lot of the young guys, you get frustrated. You're trying to make something happen. It ain't happened. So you get the big hammer and you hit it harder. Well, anyway, and I'm not trying to tell a story for Ray, but I've heard the story a jillion times. He couldn't get it done with this Hondu horse. So he solicited Tom Dorrance and Tom was pretty new to that area. He had a ranch in Oregon that he had just sold and basically retired, earlier mid-50s. So he's still a fairly young man, but not to get into that history too far. He come down there, we're just kind of putting around, visiting his brothers, as Bill in California. And so anyway, that's kind of why the Tom and Ray name is a lot more familiar than Melvin Jones or Gene Lewis or a lot of the other mentors that I have. Some people know them, but a lot of people don't.
Guys that were kind of up there on that level as far as their skills and handiness, right? But just because they weren't on the same education clinic train as they were, maybe.
As Melvin Jones, for example, he was very, very talented. A lot of natural ability. You'd ask him, how do you do that? Well, I'll show you. He couldn't tell you. He could show you. But at least I had that picture of what it should look like, and I kind of worked toward that. But Melvin was one of my mentors. Gene Lewis, another guy he's actually my mom's first cousin. He went on to win a lot of shows in California, and he actually got into the jumping horses and trained a lot of horses for the Olympic teams and blah, blah, blah. I mean, he was a high-level horseman. And I had connections, through family or good friends or whatever. And so when I got out of high school, I threw my bedroll in my 20-year-old truck and I beat it down there to spend time with those guys. But yeah, Van Normans and, like I say, the Joneses, Tom Marvel, I spent, I worked for him. I never got paid. And I don't mean that he cheated me. First year and a half or so that I left home, I'd shoe a horse or do something, but they was feeding me and they gave me a place to stay, and I never went to town hardly. So I didn't need any money. That was my college education. I didn't have to pay for it. And, like in the winter when Tom's deal kind of shut down, the ranching deal slowed down, I went to California and spent a winter with Gene Lewis, and Ray said he'd pay me. I said, hey, that's not why I'm here. I just want to learn. I don't care if you pay me or not. You don't have to pay me. Not that I had money. I just didn't spend money, so I didn't need money. They fed me. They put me up. I didn't go anywhere. It took very little gas money. I didn't smoke. I just didn't need, the money, because they didn't have any. If they paid me $400 a month later, I'd still have $400.
You had a whole different drug you were after.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Speaking of that, so in 2017, it was a while before this that you partnered up with a doctor named Stephen Peters, who is I want to say neuroscientist, correct? Or neuroscientist. And at Sage Creek, we held an evidence-based horsemanship clinic. It was a super fascinating discussion for me as a 17-year-old to be in on that conversation with all these other people who were interested in kind of getting a scoop into talking about the mindset and the brain of the horse in a way we'd all never heard before. So you guys authored a book together called Evidence-Based Horsemanship. I want to talk what inspired that book, what brought up that conversation, and what does that mean, I guess, for you? I know it's a loaded question, but
I'll try to give you a brief introduction in 25 words or less.
Okay.
I was doing a demonstration in Fort Worth, a colt starting demonstration, and they had other people, I do this for 45 minutes or an hour, and then somebody else comes in and, kind of a mini expo or something, if you will. And so my turn was up, and a friend of mine was going to do a demonstration with the horse next. And I hadn't been around him for a while, and so I was really eager to kind of see what he was going to talk about and kind of where his journey has evolved to, and like that. And so I get done with my deal, and I book it up in the stands and get a front row seat, basically, where I can see what he's doing and take that in. And this guy with clean fingernails come up and sit beside me and start asking me questions. And I'm going, you obviously don't ride horses and work on a ranch. I mean, you're not tanned, your fingernails are clean, and you obviously have an office job of some kind. And so he's wanting to ask me this and that and the other. And I'm kind of answering him, but my focus is on what's going on in the round pen here. And finally he starts talking about, the horse's mind or the horse brain or something like that. And I'm going, all right, well, you kind of sound like you got some interesting to talk about. And you're not just, you run into this all the time after clinic. Everybody wants to be your best friend and they want, private clinic, private information. And that's kind of where I thought he was going with that. Can you answer 5 questions for me? No, I really don't want it. That's not what I want to do right now. If we go have dinner or something, or you invite me dinner, yeah, I might share some ideas with you, but you're kind of interrupting me, basically. And so anyway, I said, well, I tell you what, I really want to see what my friend's doing here. Can we have dinner tonight? Because it sounds like I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. And of course, he wanted to know what I was kind of doing with this colt, basically, and how I was getting inside his mind and blah, 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 whatever. So anyway, we went to dinner and we compared notes. He was asking me about how I worked horses. And the more he talked about the horse brain, and I'm like, well, okay, so I kind of think that horses, kind of operate from this level. Yeah, and he goes into the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system and blah, 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 and the cortisone. But a lot of the stuff that he was talking about, he might as well have been speaking Spanish. I barely finished high school, and I didn't take biology or anything that I had any knowledge of these scientific terms, like adrenaline. So anyway, we spent quite a few conversations over the phone and in person, and he had the science, but he didn't have the practical application. So he'd done his research and, in other clinicians and everything, but he pulled me out of the lineup because he could tell that I was getting into the chemistry of the horses, which I didn't even know that's what I was doing. But he explained why it was working. I said, well, okay, if I'm stirring the cocktail and they're getting hooked on the cocktails I'm giving them and they're producing the things I want to produce, okay, I guess I'm the bartender. And it's,
You had the experience in your own language attached to those experiences.
I didn't even have a language. You can't say, okay, horse, today we're going to do blah, blah, blah.
You just knew it.
You just do it.
Yeah, it's just what you do.
I know when I get this horse excited, for example, not afraid, excited, he's on the high alert. Now, that's just short of being afraid. He's going, and it's above being curious. It's past being curious. And I kind of got him trapped, let's say. He's like looking for a place out of the trap. I haven't sprung the trap on him, but he knows. So now in the live trap, let's call it, I let him out the gate here. Okay, now he knows when I put this stress on him, he goes that way. That's sympathetic, parasympathetic, whatever. And when he gets over here, okay, that's where he gets flooded with the serotonin or the dopamine or whatever the good drugs are. But I was mixing cocktails and the natural chemistry in those horses, more so than just doing the tricks, with the ropes and everything that, I've seen a lot of the old guys do. But thinking back on what I observed Tom doing, he was a master bartender. He could excite them horses to a level and then back off. And that horse wanted to go back to that level because You couldn't get to the cocktail without getting that adrenaline raised up first. Tom didn't explain it that way. I didn't perceive it that way until Steve explained it. And I mean, I'm not as good as explaining his science, but that's why that's the good bond between us.
Yeah.
He can explain the science. I can explain the application. And when they get about so far here, you don't want to scare them. You don't want to panic them, but you do need to arouse them.
Yeah.
He calls it sympathetic arousal.
Yeah.
I never would have come up with that term, but he puts these kind of warm and fuzzy names to it, so it's more acceptable. But it's a fine line between getting that horse out of his comfort zone without scaring him. And Steve, as a matter of fact, said you got the parasympathetic and the sympathetic.
Yeah.
And he explained to me what that was. I said, no, there's a lot of levels in between there. And the secret to me of being a good horseman is to be able to define those different layers and where do you want to operate from. You can get a horse really, really bothered up here. Let's just say a Mustang. Everybody, can relate to a Mustang. Their past can be traumatic, blah, blah, blah. You don't have to scare them. They come to you scared. I'm talking about the fresh ones.
Yeah.
Not the ones that, been in your backyard for 20 years.
Right.
So they come to you on the high alert. Their ears are just like buzzsaws. You don't have to get them out of their comfort zone. They're already there. And you can turn him way over here, right, left, inside, outside. They're ready to roll up there, 3 steps and stops.
Yeah.
Right there when you change the balance point on him. Now you walk him out here, 10 steps, and stop him, 10 steps. Not 10, not 9, not 11. You're working that horse. And the only reason he's moving is because you're engaging his flight zone. Yeah. You're scaring him. He's taking flight.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people, well, that's not a warm, fuzzy term. I don't care what you call it.
Yeah.
That horse is trying to get away from me, and I'm making use of it. Yeah. And pretty quick, this horse figures out, and this is the basis of my horsemanship, is the horse figures out it's more comfortable with me than it is trying to get away from me. So instead of trying to get away, pretty soon he learns to get with me. And then, he licks his lips, and that's what Steve observed in Fort Worth when we were working this colt, however many years ago it was. And he said, that's, you're making that work. Yeah.
Gotcha. So one of the big things I'm taking away from that is, in the last thing you were saying, you're looking at the mental stasis. So you know what horse you even have to work with in the beginning, right? It's not, whether he's in flight mode or is he down in relaxed mode? Is he up on his chemicals? Is he alert? Wherever he's at. And then you were using that, right? Or trying to get to whatever stasis you need him to be in order to obtain the best learning, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah. And you're not holding him there.
Yeah.
You might take them to the edge of the world. And I'm not sure if they're going over the edge, they could die. I mean, that's how they think. They're a prey animal.
Yeah.
And if they didn't have that natural fear of a predator, we wouldn't have them. They'd be like the woolly mammoths, or they'd be extinct. That's what kept them alive, is being cautious around the predators, whether it be a lion or a human. And that's what makes them easy to train, is all you got to do is just make them a little uncomfortable in that corner of the corral, and they go to the other corner of the corral. And pretty quick, they get a rhythm, they get a synchronization with you, and that just carries into getting your hands on them and handling them. And, we was talking about this morning. I don't try to desensitize that horse and get him to accept me. I use his escape mode, educate him in. Through that process, we start building this trust. And I trust him. It's him learning to trust me, that I'm not going to violate him. I'm not going to hurt him. But it's just this little bit of, I don't know if I'm comfortable here, and they go over there. Yeah. You try to do as little as you can to get as much as you can. And so anyway, that's kind of the basis of my program, is how much of this natural escape mode can I use to my advantage? And it's not something that we're just going to keep them engaged, for hours and hours and hours. That might have a place in some situations, but I'm not about exhausting them physically to get to their mind. I would rather keep their mind fresh. And if we get a little bit of progress, I like to start at least 2 or maybe 3 or 4 horses in the round corral all at the same time. Because I go over here and I work this bay horse, let's say. He makes some progress. But I get up there and he lets me pet him. Okay? Now I'm going to go over here and start working with this other horse. The bay horse gets a rest. Yeah. And that's one of my best tools in the toolbox, is how to manage the stress to your advantage. In other words, they get on the high alert. What are you going to do now? And they do this, do that, do the other. Okay, let's let him rest, and I'll go back to the bay horse. He's had a rest. He's got the dopamine, the serotonin. He's licked his lips and all that. Maybe he's even got a hind leg cocked over there. Yeah. But it was the stress that allowed him to come back and find that cocktail.